All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Um, and for those of you who are not aware or hadn't seen, we shortened the day a little bit. Our presenters from the co-ops and the municipal power utilities had some conflict. So, well, I think the day will be shortened a little. We tried to add some in some other sessions, but that should get you home a little bit sooner. But our next session is on the issue of environmental impact requirements. As we were talking about earlier, Carl asked about like what are the environmental groups we're thinking about storage. You know, this conversation is going to be a lot about what are the impacts of all the different developments, all the different transmission, wind, solar, what it all does, how's it work, who are the players, and what's the community thinking about. So with that, we have our first presenter is Caleb Arthur with Sun Solar. And our second presenter will be Jennifer Campbell with the Missouri Department of Conservation. And then that will be followed up by Jason Humphrey at Evergy. Caleb, are you on?
Yes.
Fantastic. So if you just want to let us know when to turn, we'll turn.
You're good to start. Okay.
Yep.
So first up is the we're going to talk about the environmental impact requirements on utility scale solar. So obviously these are mostly going to be ground mounted solar installations. So you can go up to the next one. This just is a little bit of background on me. Mostly just kind of the current one is Sun Solar. We're been in business 11 years. We have more than 300 employees now. You guys heard earlier Joe Bolin talk about the EIERA. I'm also a commissioner and the chairman of the EIERA, so have a lot of experience there, but not near as much as Joe. So he's kind of the expert there, but definitely been a pleasure serving on there for a little over 3 years. So excited to get work done there too. So you can go on to the next one. So utility scale solar regulations. Utility scale solar is defined as anything more than 1 megawatt of solar. These installations are subject to a variety of regulations at the federal, state, and local levels. And then one key regulation for utility scale solar installations is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. This act requires federal agencies to assess the environmental impacts of their actions, including construction and operation of solar installations. This assessment includes consideration of the impact on wildlife, water resources, and air quality. Go to the next. Ground mount solar regulations. Ground mount solar installs are those that are installed directly on the ground as opposed to on a rooftop or other structures. These installations are also subject to regulations at the federal, state, and local levels. One of the key regulations for ground mount solar installs is the Clean Water Act. This act regulates the discharge of pollutants into our navigable waters, which can be impacted by the construction and operation of ground mount solar installations. Environmental impact assessments. Both utility scale solar or any type of ground mount solar installations on a larger scale will require an environmental impact assessment, an EIA, prior to construction. This assessment looks at the potential impact of an installation on the environment and provides recommendations for mitigating any negative impacts. EIAs typically include a review of the site's geology, topography, hydrology, and ecology. They also consider factors such as noise, visual impact, and the impact on nearby communities. So something that has popped up over the last few years on these has been reflectivity of solar panels at airports. Even the Springfield Branson Airport, when they were looking at doing a site selection for bids, and we worked on bids over there, that was one of the things that they've talked about was the reflectivity of solar panels for pilots taking off and landing airplanes at the airport. And that's become a very popular place. Denver Airport, there's so many, probably 40, 50 airports now have big, massive solar farms around them. And so you always have to take even things like that into consideration. Something that's came up this year is when we were discussing the property tax issue around utility scale solar on the state's commission that I was on. There were state senators asking about the impacts of utility scale solar on farmland, and then what were the environmental impacts on the farmland, and that was brought up on this commission. So there's been a lot of questions even on the state level now, and so you're starting to see more and more as more and more solar farms utility scale solar farms get built in the state of Missouri. You're starting to see a lot more people starting to ask these questions, including state reps and state senators, farmers. You're starting to see county commissioners talk about regulations of utility scale solar farms for a multitude of different reasons. And so you're really going to start hearing more about the environmental impact, whether it be good or bad, in people's minds around utility scale solar farms in the future. You can go to the next slide. Environmental policies related to stormwater and drainage. This is becoming a bigger one. You don't think a lot about it in Missouri, but obviously we have a lot of water runoff, and so that's something that we have to be very cognizant of. You can work, a lot of it's going to be working with Department of Natural Resources and making sure that the regulations that they have in place, that those aren't being negatively affected for the environment that the installation is going to be installed in. You don't think much about it when you're out in these big open fields, but a lot of times you can definitely negatively affect the area if it's not done correctly, with the erosion control and drainage systems and things like that. So it's something to be aware of. You can go to the next one. Environmental policies related to wetlands. This one's something that I'm not as familiar with. I've not really ran across this one, but the Army Corps of Engineers talks about regulations in place to protect the wetland areas. It can vary wildly among local offices in Missouri, but obviously you need to really do your due diligence and making sure that you're following and have careful consideration around any wetlands. So that's obviously something that's coming up a lot more now too. You can go to the next one. This is a big one, and I think this is going to be done by another one of our presenters. So I'll just kind of high level this one, but bats are a major concern, endangering, the bat populations. And so that's something that we have to really take into consideration. It's, wind turbines, solar, any kind of renewable energy, any kind of construction project, just making sure that we don't harm the bat population, especially in Missouri. Just building right behind my house on the acreage here, they were doing the Kansas Expressway roadway project, and there was a bat population concern. And that drug out for years, doing all the surveys and all the extra work they had to do for the bat populations here. And so you can really mess up your project if it's not done correctly. And so that's something with having endangered species like that, you really have to make sure that you're doing it correctly. And so that can be a major issue. But our other speaker, I think, is going to hit on that one and has way more expertise on that one than I do. So you can go to the next slide. This is also one that I don't know that much about, but obviously if you get into more using federal funds, grants, and loans, you can trigger these. But environmental policies relating to cultural reviews. So definitely important. You want to kind of understand what you're getting yourself into whenever you are dealing with artifacts, historical structures. Sometimes you'll get into these if you are in certain areas doing dirt work, moving. You get into certain areas and you can, if you don't have the right things done at the right time and you harm an important cultural resource, you can definitely get shut down. If you come across artifacts, then you can end up getting shut down and everything put on pause, and then everybody has to come in and do their due diligence. And I've seen reports of this happening. Thankfully, it's never happened on any projects that I've been around, but it can really throw a project off. And so you want to do your due diligence on making sure that you do a cultural review with as thorough as you can before starting a project. So you can go to the next slide. So in addition to the recommendations provided in the EIA, there's several ways that installations can mitigate their impact on the environment. One way is through the use of native vegetation around the installation. This can help to reduce erosion and provide habitat for wildlife. Another way is through the use of advanced technology. Some solar installations use tracking systems that follow the sun throughout the day, which can increase efficiency and reduce the need for additional land. So it's becoming very popular. Whenever I first started in solar, you didn't hardly see any tracking systems. And now you're seeing, at least half of the utility scale solar systems getting installed are tracking systems. And what's unique about tracking systems is they can generate 20 to 30% more power depending on what kind of tracking systems they are. And so you can actually make the entire footprint area of the solar array smaller and generate more power. And so effectively you need less solar panels. And you can do it anything from a very small scale to residential up to utility scale. I have a small tracker at my house and it can generate 35% more power because it's a dual access tracker. It tracks north, south, east, and west every day, all day long. And it can catch the sun from sun up till sundown, wintertime and summertime, where most utility scale will just track, like east and west versus along other than dual access, north and south. But those can definitely be applied on utility scale. Now there's an added cost for tracking and there's can be added maintenance, but a lot of times those are definitely have pay for themselves because of the added production of the panels, but needing to install less panels. So there's usually a strong argument for a return on investment to be able to do a tracker if the location can handle the tracker where there's not hills or shading concerns or things like that. So you can go to the next one. So solar energy has the potential to provide a significant resource of renewable energy. You've seen that from previous speakers today. However, it's important that solar installations are done in an environmentally responsible manner. Regulations and environmental impact assessments play a critical role in ensuring that solar installations have a minimal impact on the environment. By following these regulations and implementing mitigation strategies, we can continue to expand our use of solar energy while protecting the environment for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caleb. Are there any questions from the audience? See if we have any online as well. No questions online? All right. Caleb, I hope you are feeling better. Thank you very much for taking time today and joining us. And we'll talk soon. Next up, we have Jennifer Campbell from the Missouri Department of Conservation. You just gotta hit the arrow button forward. Right, do you want to use that or what? Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Campbell. I'm a policy coordinator at the Department of Conservation, and I'm our point of contact for when there are developers or other folks who want to learn about minimizing impacts from wind and solar or even transmission. Transmission and solar are not my assignment, so I'll mostly focus on wind today, and we had some coverage on the solar issue earlier, which is very helpful. So I'll briefly cover my assumptions about your knowledge level, and so you can follow up with questions afterwards if I'm completely off base there. I visited with Josh earlier this week about your knowledge level of renewable energy and impacts and laws that might apply to that. So I'm going to go through that pretty fast. I'll talk about what makes Missouri unique for wind development in terms of wildlife. And then talking about a piece of the pie and build out. So pie would be kind of wildlife impact, the slice that individual projects can have. And then I'll talk a little bit about risk management for developers or of interest potentially to commissions and other folks, because I really want to talk, I hope today we can talk about some of the meat, not just like the how to get permitted type stuff. Do y'all see anything on that? Okay, so I'm going to assume that you all know these acronyms here. So we're talking about wildlife and pollution control laws that apply to wind projects and to a degree as well solar projects. So the one on top, BGEPA, is for bald eagles, bald and golden eagles. To the right of it is CWA, Clean Water Act. Below that, you have MBTA, Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Then on the far left, you have ESA, that's the Endangered Species Act, and that's where I'll focus most of my discussion. NEPA has already been discussed. It ties into all of these because federal agencies, when they issue a permit or give money, typically have to show that whatever their decision is about how they're rolling out that program or those dollars or those permits, it's not impacting what's called the human environment. Basically, that involves all kinds of things like cultural resources, view sheds, as well as wildlife that the public may have invested dollars in through the federal or state governments. The last one on the bottom is NHPA, National Historic Preservation Act. This deals with cultural resources, and it's one of several laws. But this is, as was mentioned before, if there are historic buildings or arrowheads or other features from history or prehistory, there are laws that apply to that that could come up in the development of these projects. I want you to know that these laws that are shown here are, for the most part, regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I'll have you notice that it's not the Missouri Department of Conservation. We do not regulate these laws. So I'm kind of here pinch hitting, letting you all know that these exist, but we don't regulate them. What else? Yes, okay. So those, well, on the bottom, we have several other regulators that you all are probably aware of and have been discussed to some degree already today. So Missouri's unique setting. This image here on the right is a tool that was developed by the Nature Conservancy to help wind developers in the central portion of the United States find locations that are lower risk. So this is not just to the Department of Conservation and Missouri, but so it's got wildlife that we conserve in certain areas, but also other conservation partners. For example, the Missouri Prairie Foundation and others. Oftentimes these groups get together and say, what are our overlapping priority areas? And that's what this map is. So this is called Site Wind Right, and you can get to it from the Nature Conservancy website. What you'll see is I've circled Missouri there, and I've drawn an arrow to show you that bat roosts are pretty important. We have one endangered bat called the Indiana bat, which about 40% of its entire range throughout the United States, the population is here in Missouri. And so they're especially vulnerable in Missouri to strikes with wind turbines or other features. It's possible to get information from the Department of Conservation and the Fish and Wildlife Service about where these records occur. And often the consultants, maybe not everyone in this room, but your consultants would go collect this information from us as they're helping you figure out the siting considerations. And I do see at least one consultant here. I know they do that. So that's the Fish and Wildlife Service has a site called IPAC, and Department of Conservation, ours is the Natural Heritage Review Report. And if y'all weren't engineers or lawyers, and you had a lot of time on your hands, you could do all this work on your own. The wildlife, what's in the area, kind of, I forget what y'all call it, that baseline report, the early stage development. But I want to let you know that also a lack of records on these does not mean there are no species of concern. It means that, you know, so like 95% of Missouri is private land, and most of these projects will be developed on private land. So we just don't have records from there. And it's possible that things could be found, but this does give you a broad brush idea. I want you to notice in particular in Missouri, the northeast corner. That is really close to where we have 40% of our Indiana bats. There's one hibernacula in Hannibal where they spend most of their time in the winter. There are some other places, but Missouri is also unique because those bats spend their hibernation period in Missouri, their migratory period where they're going from there to their summer wintering grounds where they have maternity colonies. So they're mammals, they produce live young, they lactate. So we have maternity colonies, migration, and overwintering that happens, and there's quite a bit for that species in the northeast part of the state. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for coming up with how do we keep species that are very rare or endangered from going extinct. And they identify different regions for recovery units, and they have certain parameters they operate within, the certain amount of take that they can, the number of animals that they can let you kill without likely causing the population to go extinct. These are the recovery units for Indiana bat, just Indiana bat. There are other species in Missouri that are of concern, but just to show you an example here. So when you go through Endangered Species Act, which was one of those laws we talked about, they would be assessing the resources, how much take each individual project, and then within the pink area that's shown Missouri, Illinois, and parts of Iowa and others, how much can happen just in that area to make sure that the population does not collapse. But the Endangered Species Act is a voluntary compliance program. So we have 3 projects right now that are operating in Missouri that have Endangered Species Act permits for bats. 3. But we actually have like 10 or 12 projects that are operating. So there's a number of projects that elected, they didn't think that their risk was very high. They elected not to get a permit. Let's see. I will say that most of the projects that we're seeing now, the new ones in development, we've got over 20 of those. Most of them are seeking some sort of permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service. It might be Endangered Species Act or Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Oh, shoot. I didn't realize that was that was triggered by animation. So this was 2019's figures, which show there are 36% of the range wide in our recovery unit, which is called the Ozark Central Region. And since then, in 2021, or it might have been 2022, it's actually increased a bit. It's a little closer to 40 there. So let's talk about the pie, because this affects development. How many projects can we put on the ground? We've seen some build out scenarios which have a lot more of renewables than are currently present in Missouri, like tens of orders more, right? So if you take a percentage of the population, so the total population of Indiana bat is right here throughout their range, and I'm sorry, not throughout the range, in our recovery unit, and you take a percentage of it that might be nominal. So like if you allowed companies to impact that many bats, we don't think that they would collapse. So this example is 1%. For Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, it's a different assumption. And as more projects get on the landscape, it could be that the number either goes up or down, that percentage. But I just want to kind of give you a figure. So let's say that in those states, I'm going to go back, in those states where we're having wind development, and there's a lot, this is the number we're looking at, potentially. That's how many could be taken in a single year. Not like over the whole life of the project, but a single year. So then you got to look at, so there are 8 permitted projects in our recovery unit. I mentioned there are 3 in Missouri, but there are 8 in the recovery unit. And then there are quite a few that are in some form of development. That's down here. And then there's quite a few that are seeking permits or are likely to seek permits. And then I kind of get into the question, you know, is everything that in the queue that we're reviewing right now and everything that's already on the ground going to make up that gap with some of the projections of how much wind there will be? And, you know, you could easily develop a concern about how much future development will be possible from the standpoint of the amount of bats that you can take. Let's see. So it's really that the pie is finite. There's only a certain amount that you can take. And there's some things you can do to make the pie bigger, and there's some things you could do to make the pie smaller. But the thing to know is that as more projects come on the landscape, the amount left here, so right now we have, I think it's 50. This represents 50, this little slice of, wait a minute, the 50 permitted projects, 50 Indiana bats per year out of the 8 permitted projects. So it's not really a ton from that number, but oh man, we've got a huge queue. Like I said, over 20 projects, and that's not the ones that are already working with us. Those are the ones that we know are doing their early wildlife studies, and then we'll hear from them later. So you kind of got to wonder, how can we best put these projects on the landscape? It really comes down to siting is the best way to reduce wildlife impact, where you put the project. But even for poorly sited projects, there is technology available to reduce those impacts. The reason it's not popular is it costs money. It eats at the bottom line of a project. So if you're doing curtailment, which is where they choose not to operate at lower wind speeds when the bats might be more active, and you wait until the wind is more, you're cutting off the bottom of the power curve, which is here. So this is, I love graphs. I hope you do too. So this is a power curve that shows the power that could be produced hypothetically and a few curtailment scenarios. So often what we're seeing is 5 meters per second would be, they're not going to operate below 5 meters per second. 6.9 until recently had been considered full avoidance for Indiana bat, but we've learned that they still are active at that wind speed. So the point being is that if you're not operating until 5 and you're in a low wind state, let's say 10 meters per second or 15 meters per second, whatever it would be, this whole area in green is basically where you're producing power. But if you're required to curtail, you've got to forgo this much if you're going to full avoidance. So that has huge impacts, as you can imagine, on the amount of power that can be produced from a project, the amount of money that can be made from a project. And so it's just not that popular to do curtailment. But even the other technologies, they all come with a significant cost. So it's kind of a balancing act, the fulcrum between wildlife impacts and how much energy can you produce, but it's a risk. So where is the risk, right? So when you're managing risk, it's important to know, where is this project sited? What's the wildlife resource like? Because you might be looking at, for example, if you're the regional transmission organization, you're thinking about power congestion in certain areas. Well, what if you don't actually have the capacity that you're thinking you're going to have? Because wind, of course, is an intermittent resource. It's not a base load type resource. So if you're thinking you're going to be able to get this much out of a single project on a transmission line, but oops, they whacked a bunch of bats, and now you don't get that part of the power curve. You're getting some portion of it. That's something to be aware of, both from, you know, the commission standpoint, from the regional transmission, and even the utility needs to be aware of that, because that will affect their bottom line too, especially if they're an investor-owned utility. It could. Let's see. There's also mitigation that can be done to manage risk. That's a really popular thing that we're seeing, but it doesn't really make up for everything. So what I want to show you on this graph here is future development. So I kind of got at this, and maybe I'm beating a dead horse now, but you know, we're charged at the national level with these policies to roll out more renewable energy. But we're going to come to a point where the amount of wildlife take that can occur safely without, you know, causing a population to crash is finite. And so as those projects are all coming online, in the way they're competing with each other over the amount of take that they can have. So that's a risk. I don't know how it's managed. I mean, that's really way above my pay grade. I'm hoping someone in this room will have a brilliant idea about it. But the other thing is, the other risk is there are a lot of bats that are not listed, and they're declining in population. So we may end up, this is a little symbol for chasing Endangered Species Act listings. You know, right now we have, you know, 5 bats we're worried about. It may end up being a lot more bats that we've got to deal with if we can't get these conservation measures right. So I talk about this a lot. There's a role in conservation for pretty much every sector. Advocacy, those are folks like the Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, and others, Trumpeter Swan Society, a bunch of them. Department of Conservation plays a role here as an advisor, because again, we're not a regulator. Fish and Wildlife Service and others are regulators, as I mentioned earlier. But there's also a private sector decision that really gets us across the wire. And it really can't happen without everybody having a part in there. I mean, you just aren't going to get all the way to that goal because it's complex. It's not a simple issue. I think that was really what I wanted to say about that. And then I'll take any questions. It may have been pretty fast. Sorry.
No, thank you, Jennifer. I did have one question. I wanted to know what your stomach felt like when you saw Jeff's map of 2050 in Missouri covered entirely in blue.
I have seen that map actually at a research meeting a couple of years ago. I've seen like lesser versions of it, and it seems like each year there's more and more. But the reality is, I kind of wonder in my mind if the fulcrum is how much power we need to produce, right? It's kind of like when you have more wildlife impact, it means you're getting greater wildlife impact over here, you're getting less power, right? Because what happens is when you've got to curtail and you weren't planning to curtail, you're not producing the energy. And it has financial effects for the company too. But I mean, overall for the grid, for the state, for renewable energy, there's less. So I really think siting is the best way to deal with that. So please contact us if you're developing a project. We will do our best to help you, especially with the data that we already have and know about. But at this point, with some of the things that I've been hearing from companies we're working with now, there's a lot of question about, well, should it be 1%, 2%, 5% of the population in our recovery unit that should be allowed to take for an endangered species? Okay, so where's the balance if we do that? Because if you're allowed to take that much, how much is left for the other companies that will develop? So anyways, I've seen that map, and I just think it's not going to go away. It's going to occur, right? Unless Congress gets all, you know, does their stuff, gets busy. Go ahead.
Is that Fish and Wildlife that kind of makes that determination?
Yeah, but here's the thing. Now, I don't work in developing those regulations, but it seems like a little bit of a moving target based on how much wind is on the ground and how much is expected over time. So you can look at any of the habitat conservation plans that are posted on the Fish and Wildlife Service website for Indiana bat, for example. They'll have an analysis of cumulative impact. So that's like what's going to happen in our recovery unit when all the anticipated wind comes online, in addition to the proposed project that the federal government would permit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just curious who was tasked
I mean, so the document itself is generated by the applicant, right? But the Fish and Wildlife Service has to be able to pass the red face test because they can be dragged into court for making unreasonable assumptions by interest groups.
How do you collect data and measure the populations of a bat before and after a project?
So there is a very specific process for endangered species. It's a little different for eagles, for example, because they're not endangered. On the endangered species and the bats in particular, there is an approach called evidence of absence. It means when you're monitoring for 2 years before you build your project, you have to plan ahead in the level of rigor of your data that you're going to say pretty well what you think is on site. It doesn't mean that's what you're going to kill because you might not be getting all the migration or conditions can change. But there's 2 years of data collected. It's an incremental approach. There's multiple tiers. It starts out where you're kind of looking at, is there the presence of the species? And then you're trying to figure out how dense are they? And then you're trying to find out, well, is this just a migratory area? Is this an area where they're reproducing, or is this an area where they're overwintering? What's the role of this area? If it's all three, or well, actually, it's usually not all three, but if it's 2 of the 3, then it's a higher risk area. So then the next step is when they build their project, after they come up with that document I mentioned called the Habitat Conservation Plan, it says all the ways that they're going to try to reduce their impacts. And once the project's built and operational, then they need to continue doing monitoring to show that what they thought or estimated their minimization efforts like curtailment or others were effective in the way they thought it would be, but also because there's not a one-to-one correlation between what they find on the ground before the project's built and what they find afterwards. It's really based on a lot of empirical estimates.
Fantastic. I don't think we have any questions online. Jennifer, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Jennifer for her time. All right. Our next presenter is Jennifer. Do you still have the stick? Oh, there it is. Sorry, never mind. Found it. All right. So our next presenter, Jason with Evergy. And Jason will go ahead and manage the slides for you. There we go.
Brilliant. Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfect.
Oh, my screen changed. There we go. All right. So I'm going to talk about this topic from the perspective of the utility. So Evergy is a name familiar to most in Kansas City, but I'll reorient everybody on who we are. But what we are trying to do is just important. That really impacts our generation addition decisions and how we think about balancing these 3 guiding principles that we have. So Evergy attacks the problem of how to serve the electricity needs and energy needs of its customers, really looking at 3 core pillars of our business. Those 3 pillars are affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And the energy transition and how we do that from an environmentally responsible position really impacts all 3 of these spheres. You know, zero fuel cost energy sources. Oh, if you could go stay on that slide for a minute. Zero fuel cost energy resources really help us think about affordability. Largely, we're offsetting fossil fuels, which are not zero fuel cost. And so they can help our customers' bottom line through a reduction in the fuel portion of their bills. Reliability becomes the biggest challenge to solve with intermittent resources, and those can be impacted, as we heard by the previous speaker, through wildlife-related curtailments, or intermittency can come when the resource isn't there. Either the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And so we have to think about how we balance those competing priorities of zero fuel cost and working on affordability with the overall reliability of the grid and how we keep the energy firm. And then finally, most intuitively, we've got the sustainability focus for the company. All of us want greener energy sources. And so finding ways to deliver that while taking care of the wildlife or externalities that may exist at a site is critically important. At the end of the day, we give the appropriate weight to the three of these goals as we move towards site selection and how we overall think about our fleet. So now you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a depiction of Evergy's service territory. Evergy was formed as a company in 2018 when Kansas City Power and Light and Westar Energy combined to make a utility that really goes through the eastern third of Kansas and the western third of Missouri and provides the day-to-day energy needs from an electricity standpoint of our customers. And so our fleet, as we go west to east in this picture, you can see that Evergy has substantial investment both in owned and purchased power resources for wind out in the wind belt in the western part of the state. Not depicted on here are 2 Oklahoma wind farms that we have. And so we've invested heavily in that wind resource that really impacts overnight energy generation at its best, but also provides really, really high energy density for wind. Some of these sites have nearly 50% capacity factor, which is just tremendous for a renewable resource. As we get more into the green, which is the old Westar service territory or Kansas Central territory now, we can see more of our traditional central station power generators. And this comes in the form of gas, coal, and a nuclear facility called Wolf Creek. You can see in Burlington, Kansas, kind of on the edge of the green and the blue. And so we employ a number of different generation technologies, each with a different role within our territory in order to provide that around the clock energy need that all of us are really counting and depending on as we go about our day-to-day lives in day-to-day businesses. One key takeaway from this slide is the geographic diversity of generation sites that we have today. Our wind is spread out, our central station power largely built up around the communities that it served. And so generation for a lot of the history of the electric grid in the United States has been hyper local. But as you can see with the intermittent resources that we have out in the western part of the state, we have a real need to transmit that energy back to load today. Think about where Kansas City is on this map. You know, other than Osborne and Soldier Creek, there's not a lot of geographically close renewable resources today to the Kansas City metro area. And so in addition to the siting and sustainability things that we think about as we site generation, we're also thinking about those paths for transmission lines where we can permit and get easement and right of way in order to take that clean green energy out from where it is generated back to the load that it serves. You advance to the next slide, please. So Evergy's customer profile after that combination of Kansas City Power and Light and Westar leaves us with about 1.5 million residential customers, which are about 38% of our energy sales, about 200,000 commercial customers making up a little bit more than 40% of our energy sales, and finally about 7,000 industrial customers generating nearly 20% of sales from just that very small population. And the neat thing about being the energy provider to this region is each of these different customers has different energy profiles, energy demands, and desires out of the generation that they are getting. But I can tell you, regardless of customer class, the hope and expectation is that we continue to green our portfolio and provide customers with more and more renewables, more and more non-carbon emitting generation. And so today, out of a total generating fleet of almost 17 gigawatts, we have about 4,500 megawatts of renewables that we are providing to our customers. And on an energy basis, as I will show later, we're nearly 50% carbon free today. So while we talk about the environmental impacts of local siting of generation and the environmental impacts of the transmission lines and distribution lines we have, one of the biggest environmental impacts that we are working towards is how do we reduce carbon emissions for our fleet. Next slide, please. And so thinking about that walk over time of what our generation portfolio looks like to support the reduction of carbon emissions is a really important and really step-by-step kind of walk. We cannot transition overnight. Permitting a wind site, as the previous speaker indicated, is a multi-year, multi-phase process that is wrought with risk along the way. And so having a measured, thoughtful, and progress-based approach to that generation transition is critically important. So on the left side of the graph in front of you, you can see what Evergy's generation fleet looked like in 2005 in the capacity we have. And you can see more than 52% of the capacity of the system was coal, with about 38% natural gas, 9% nuclear, and just 1% in 2005 of the nameplate capacity of the fleet was provided by renewable resources. So 10% in aggregate was carbon free on a nameplate basis. Fast forward to the year we just completed in 2022, and now coal has been reduced to 38% of Evergy's combined fleet, natural gas about a quarter of the fleet, and non-carbon emitting resources now are 36% of that overall nameplate capacity of the fleet. Capacity is different than energy, as we will talk about, but a huge transformation has happened in that intervening period between 2005 and 2022. But we know with the goals for reaching net zero and limiting the impact that carbon has on the planet, we need to continue that transition. And so in our 2022 Integrated Resource Plan, which is a 20-year plan that we file with the commissions of both state of Missouri and the state of Kansas, we indicated a pretty substantial transition plan between 2022 and 2030 and between 2030 and 2040 that has us reflecting in 2040 a very transformationally different makeup of our generating fleet. Just 7% of the nameplate capacity of the fleet would be coal. At that time, 21% would be kind of a firming natural gas technology. And then for the first time, we have storage or other enabling technologies like small modular reactors or potentially hydrogen providing capacity and energy for the fleet. And in the near term, you can see just the level of additions that we are talking about on the right side of the graph, with over 2,000 megawatts of solar added, 1,200 megawatts of additional wind beyond what we have today, and about 2 gigawatts of coal retirements, all in support of the goal to achieve net zero carbon by 2045. Next page, please. So it's important to understand where we're going, which was the pie charts on the previous page, but also where we have been. So we have about 4.4 gigawatts of wind on the system, as discussed previously. And in 2020, what that allowed Evergy to do was essentially have, on the energy side of the equation, the megawatt hours and kilowatt hours that end up on our customer's bill, 50% of that being carbon free, which is just an incredible transformation. 28% provided by wind, 21% nuclear, and 1% of solar, and landfill gas, giving us that 2020 energy mix of essentially 50-50. And that manifests itself in the carbon reductions that Evergy has seen since 2005. And so as we think about environmental impacts of these projects, we can't lose sight of just how transformative these technologies have been on a carbon reduction basis, with over half of the carbon being emitted on a tonnage basis than we had in 2005, kind of a key date for the Paris Accord and some other regulations. And as we've controlled our carbon emitting fleet, our fossil fleet, we've seen dramatic reductions as well in SOx and NOx, more typical clean air type controlled pollutants. Continue the next slide. So the 51% carbon reduction that we had is a really meaningful start on a path to Evergy's targets of a 70% reduction of carbon by 2030 and a 100% reduction to net zero by 2045. The goals really here being a steady, measured progress towards those ultimate goals. And we saw that with kind of the pie charts that we had earlier. But to do that, we need more renewables on the system. And so getting the renewables sited appropriately, which is a big step of every project that we perform, and looking at the environmental impacts upfront of those projects, both on local wildlife, but on air and water, are critically important as well. If we move to the next slide, we for the first time take a look at the water end of this equation. Traditional central station power generation is very, very, very water intensive. You're using water to make steam, you're using water to cool steam cycles to create a vacuum within your turbine. And so as we think about siting these new resources, one advantage that often doesn't get talked about as much with wind and solar is the dramatically reduced need for water. The amount of water Evergy is a consumer of is staggering. So in 2021, Evergy fully consumed 13 billion gallons of water. But in contextualizing that, that was only 4% of what we would have otherwise used, with 281 billion gallons returned for downstream use, all fully qualified and environmentally tested for return to the streams that they used. And so while we are a very large user of water in both states, we've been able to decrease our consumption by about half and decrease the non-consumptive use by a third. And so even for the water that we're returning, we're focused on being good stewards of the water resource that we have. And we know that this will continue to improve as we add generation technologies that are not as dependent on water as the historical methodologies with central station power have been. Next slide. So on my last slide here, I wanted to talk about 3 distinct projects that Evergy has worked on and that have gone extremely well, both from a siting and community response perspective out there. The first is the Western Plains Wind Farm. This is owned by our Kansas Central entity. It's a 280 megawatt wind site in Ford County, Kansas. And the site, as many wind farms are, was designed to continue to allow traditional agriculture and preserve the local character of the community. You can see the nice picture pointing at some wind turbines on there and a nice wheat field. One of the local kind of selling aspects of wind has traditionally been that you can continue to row crop or farm or CRP if you want to do that right up to the habitat and kind of base of that turbine. And we've been successful implementing that, as have many others. And so this still looks like rural Kansas. It's just got some wind turbines in the air when you get there. Solar is newer to the Southwest Power Pool, but as we showed in the pie charts earlier, will continue to be a growing portion of the generation mix that Evergy has. And so wanted to highlight 2 projects here. The first is the Hawthorne Solar Project. Evergy has a traditional central station generator in Kansas City at the Hawthorne site. And what we did here is actually use the existing infrastructure on site to build a 10 megawatt solar array for a subscription program on plant property, and had substantial work with the Corps of Engineers on wetland work and delineation. But as you can see in the bottom picture, right directly under the wind farm, the site was able to be built. And we've now added solar, very, very close to the Kansas City Metro for the subscription program, and had that site fully permitted, and it went commercial in January of this year. The last site I'll feature is the West Plains Solar Farm. This is a solar project that we built for a customer outside of Evergy's service territory. And this is in the West Plains, Missouri. It was sited on top of a historical landfill. So innovative, beneficial reuse of former landfill land, and has been planted with a pollinator-friendly seed mix. That in the picture in the bottom right is what it will look like after it comes up. That's actually our Baldwin site that is pictured there. But you can see the sunflowers, the clovers, really good habitats for strained pollinators where they can come, see native grasses, get pollen from the local flowers, and return those to the hives and the nests to make the nectar on which the bees rely. So we have a ton of considerations as we balance that sustainability, reliability, and affordability towards kind of making a more environmentally responsible future possible through our generation. And that comes primarily through renewable resources, as we saw in the pie charts. Josh, with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Jason. Appreciate that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is about the IRP results slide that you showed, where there was 19% of the generating capacity as energy storage after 2040 and none before 2030. And I'm just wondering if you had any input on why you think there was none before 2030, and perhaps more pointedly, if you think energy storage has been well captured and the value it can bring has been well captured in your IRP process. Thank you.
Yeah, I will say that we will study energy storage more fully in the 2023 IRP, but I'll answer a couple things generally. Energy storage is largely captured in the value of time shifting. And for the Southwest Power Pool where Evergy operates, the value of a 4-hour time shift is just not very large. Right now, we don't have something like a duck curve in California where very short duration storage provides a lot of arbitrage value to capture. So near term just doesn't quite pencil out as well as it does in some other parts of the country. I personally think it's going to be a mix of all technologies that get us to net zero, and storage certainly has a part. We'll have to kind of rationalize in the Southwest Power Pool if 4 hours is the right number, or is it something more like 8 or 12? But do think we will see storage before 2040 in the plan, and would not be surprised if we have it before 2030. I will note that Evergy actually has energy storage on the grid. I can't remember if we were the first or second company in the Southwest Power Pool to do so, but we have a 1.5 megawatt battery at the Wichita Zoo to act as a pilot for us to learn about how battery technologies may be helpful in the Southwest Power Pool, and also to provide some islanding capability for the Wichita Zoo that will let them have emergency on-site auxiliary power if there's a grid blink there. And so learning about the value of batteries within the SPP here right now today in 2023, as we prepare for that energy future where storage is likely to be a bigger part than it is today.
Jason, do you have SMR in your IRP?
We do not.
Jason, I'm wondering
sorry about that.
I'm wondering if you could speak to energy efficiency and how you use that. Evergy has quite a bit of building energy efficiency programs. How do you calculate that into your IRP?
Yeah, the demand programs that really focus particularly on energy efficiency, which helps peak shaving, are essentially kind of a negative energy demand resource in the IRP, and studies have shown through and through that that's often the best place to start. That's your cheapest peak capacity, is just getting folks to use less on that. And so our MEA programs, which is the Missouri Energy Efficiency Act, continue now. I believe we're either next couple days making a MEA 4 filing. And so that's kind of the first layer of generation we add, if you want to think about it that way, is really focusing on incentivizing those demand response and energy efficiency type programs that shave the peak and keep you from building some type of peaking capacity.
So we've heard a good bit today, just a bit ago, about some of the siting constraints that are faced with new generation in terms of wildlife. I mean, there are so many other factors you could look at as well, like transmission. How is Evergy, or is Evergy considering how it might, say, use rooftop solar or brownfield site development, which it sounds like you've already done some of, to sort of address those siting constraints?
Rooftop or demand resources would distributed resources would probably fit into those programs the previous question asked. And so we're not considering them directly, at least for large utility scale build outs, just given the cost profile of those versus utility scale options. For brownfield, that's probably the first thing I think about in the morning. The Inflation Reduction Act has incentives for brownfield redevelopment through a concept in that legislation called energy communities. And energy communities are linked to a couple of things, either former coal mining, former oil and gas, or probably what's most important for Evergy is retired coal generation. So you get enhanced tax incentives for generation that you cite within one census tract of retired coal generation. And so as we think about our self-build options going forward, those sites where we've historically had generation are certainly top of mind.
Fantastic. For those of you online, just a reminder, you can use your Q&A to ask your questions, but I don't think we have any. So please thank Caleb, Jennifer, and Jason for presenting today on this very technical but very interesting topic. Thank you. All right, so our next session deals with some topics we've kind of touched on today, and that's how energy storage in general is viewed, how it's used, policies, economics, and other items that are impacting it. We've got 3 speakers here with us today. We have Jamie Charles, who will join us virtually.